Hello, good morning, good afternoon to everyone, wherever you are. Welcome to this last edition of the Global Markets Encounter before the Easter break. We are coming to you in the English language with simultaneous translations to the French language. So please use the button at the bottom right corner to select the language of your choice. Let me also mention that we are also coming to you through MS Teams and also the Facebook Live and YouTube. The session is also being recorded so that you know it's going to be available for you to be able to refer to later on. At this stage, I would like to also acknowledge our sponsors and the partners who have made this possible. Here I'm talking about the GIZ.com Cashew, CNFA Pro Cashew, TechnoServe, Benin Cashew, SNI, Mayor, CMA, CGM, Intersnack Procurement, and Mecca. At this stage, I also know that Jim Fitzpatrick, you are already on. And if I can see you, very good, very nice. Jim, I hope everything is well at your end. And,
morning, Ernest.
Good morning. Let me not take much of your time, as today you take us through the 2022 crop and market. So welcome, and please, you may go ahead. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. You're very welcome. Hope you're going to forgive my voice this morning is a bit off. I've had this virus. You might have heard of it. It's called COVID-19, and it's not to be recommended. So forgive me if my voice is a bit off from time to time. They tell me it also leads to a thing called...
Sorry, Jim. Just go ahead. But we are sorry to hear this.
No worries. I'm still here. You can see me.
Yeah.
Unless maybe that's a video. No, it's not. Anyway, it leads to brain fog, they tell me. My daughter tells me that's nothing new for me. But if from time to time I go a bit off, maybe you'll forgive that for today.
All right.
So we're going to talk about harvests and production as usual, given that time of year. But secondly, we're going to focus in on demand and consumption. And I think this is particularly relevant because in a time of difficult to explain market movements, particularly the price of kernels, it's interesting to look at demand and have a look at some of the fundamentals behind the factors that should be influencing prices, but perhaps are not influencing prices in the way that they normally would. So we'll start with the look at an update on harvests, and we'll start, as we always do, in Asia, and we'll look at the three big Asian producers, starting with India. So we still have a situation in India where there are some doubts over the initial crop forecast, which was for a good crop. Originally, people were talking around about 750 to 775,000 tons, which would be a pretty good crop by recent standards. There are question marks over that to do with the weather situation, and they will play out in the coming weeks, but we can't be sure. But there is let's say, a slight warning signal there at the moment. In India, the import situation so far has been quite strong in the early months of the year. We've only January and February figures so far, but this is clearly an indication, as expected, I think, and as some of our Indian guests told us in past weeks, that demand is expected to be strong in India this year, and imports are expected to be strong as a result. So still some question marks on the Indian crop. This will play out over the rest of April and into May. Much more lacking clarity is the position in Cambodia, where we see articles, events, all kinds of information emerging, but we need to try somehow to put this into a context. One of the problems dealing with Cambodia is the clearly erroneous figures from last year of 1.1 million tons of trade in raw cashew nuts between Cambodia and Vietnam. This is widely recognized to be incorrect, both officially and in the trade, but it is being used mistakenly to talk about this current crop. So a couple of things I think need to be nailed down here a little bit. First of all, the hectares planted in Cambodia have risen very quickly. Cambodia added estimated 50,000 hectares in 2019 and possibly 2 in 2020. Thereafter, it naturally would slow down, and the trees that were planted after that, in any case, would not be coming to fruition just yet. There are high-yielding areas in Cambodia, of that there's no doubt, particularly those areas planted to the M23 variety, a new variety introduced about 8 years ago. But there are also older trees, more local varieties. And so if we talk about the high-yielding varieties giving high yields, 1.5 tons plus, we have to balance that with some of the other trees which are still there, which give a much lower figure. And so this variation in yield by variety, if it's not taken into account, it can be misleading. And we've seen some of that written in the past week, which can be misleading. We also should bear in mind that some of the high-yielding varieties, although they're very effective, they're more susceptible to pests and diseases and to the weather. So in a year like this, where the weather hasn't been ideal for growing cashews in Cambodia, we are seeing an impact on those. So the situation, according to, let's say, a little bit of a local survey in Cambodia, I've been lucky enough to do a lot of work over there over the years, looks to me as if you're looking at a crop somewhere around about 450 to 500,000 tons. It's not 1 million tons. It's not 700,000 tons. That is for certain. Most of it's sold. About 300,000 tons has been imported into Vietnam already. In Cambodia, the processing is still quite low, less than 5% of the crop, based on a 500,000 ton crop. And one thing I think that we need to bear in mind for the long term, we were working in Cambodia recently on fruits, on things like longan, durian, mango, and the attraction of the Chinese market and the high returns on fruits could draw farmers away from cashews into growing fruits. And that's quite likely. And we've seen some evidence of that. We have seen some cashew trees being replaced with fruit trees over the past year or so. And the reason that's happened is because in the last 2 or 3 years, the Chinese market, the enormous Chinese market for fruit, for fresh fruit, has opened for Cambodia, and they're making the most of it. Cambodian exports of fruits like bananas and longan have absolutely spectacularly risen in the past 24 months. So caution with Cambodia, the assumption that there's a huge or a 1 million ton crop there can be problematic when we analyze the market. We'll come back to that in a little bit, what that means, what that bigger crop in Cambodia means. Looking in Vietnam, definitely, as we have thought for some time, that the quantity and the quality of the crop is lower than hoped for. They tell me that about 70% is in by now. It's hard to know, of course, how much is in when you don't know the size of the crop, but that's what they're talking about. And we've seen lower farm gate prices than in recent years. That's partly explained by lower quality. The quality of raw cashew nuts generally is lower. And in the past week or 10 days, we've seen kernels prices gently rising off the bottom of the market. And whatever you think about the reasons for those low prices, we are seeing now that the market is beginning to pick up a little bit on kernels in Vietnam. Let's have a look again further at Vietnam, and we'll have a look at the import situation. So on this chart, you can see the January-March imports in the orange bars and March on its own in yellow. So you can see that over the past 4 years, the level of imports in the first quarter has risen pretty remarkably. But that in 2022, it's fallen a little bit, and that's partly to do with the Cambodian crop, of course. By the way, I've adjusted the 2021 figure downwards to make for a more realistic figure based on the Cambodian crop. As I mentioned earlier, there were some serious errors and widely accepted that they're errors. It's not me saying this, it's widely accepted that there was errors particularly in the March and April figures in Vietnam last year. And I think they're doing something to rectify that now. But if we look at this, what we're seeing is a rise of Cambodian production. And what that means is that the share of Cambodia's imports in this first quarter into Vietnam has risen dramatically. So if we go back to 2019, imports were much lower, of course, than in 2022, but Cambodia supplied only 57%, about 130,000 tons. If we look at the customs figures in 2022, Cambodia has imported 70%, about 332,000 tons into Vietnam, according to Vietnamese customs. So this means that Vietnamese processors have more raw material closer at hand. Within a couple of days, they can have it from Cambodia into their factories. And whilst that material is available, and it is, in most years, Cambodian raw cashew nuts are very high quality. They tend to be dried in Vietnam, but they tend to be quite large and they tend to be of a decent outturn. And the price reflects that. But it does give Vietnamese processors more time before they have to come and buy in West Africa. And I think one of the things that we can notice here is that the contrast between 2022 and 2017. In 2017, we had a poor crop in Vietnam. There was a certain amount of panic, prices spiraled upwards. In 2022, we've had poor crop again in Vietnam, but we haven't seen any spiraling of prices. And the reason for that is because the availability of Cambodian raw cashew nuts has exploded. So instead of 130,000 tons in 19, 332,000 tons. So this has made a significant difference. So there's absolutely no need to panic from a processor's point of view in Vietnam when they have Cambodian material. The difficulty, I suppose, is as the Cambodian crop plays out, what time do you come and what time do you buy in West Africa? Are you, by leaving the market, creating an opportunity for speculators? Are you creating an opportunity for traders to build an inventory later to be sold to the processors? It's interesting that despite low kernels prices, we haven't really seen an impact on raw cashew nut prices from West Africa. So let's have a look at the current situation in West Africa. We haven't seen any major changes in the past couple of weeks. The Nigerian situation, crop is coming in. It is interesting, by the way, to see some interventions in Nigeria to improve the logistics, which is well needed, and some supports for processing, which are also beneficial. Generally speaking, it looks as if that crop is a little bit disappointing, probably somewhere below 200,000 tons. Benin, the season has started now, 1st of April, the season officially, belatedly, but officially opened. The official estimate of the crop still remains very high, around 250,000 tons, surprisingly high indeed. But trade reports tend to suggest that the crop is not as good as that, in fact, nowhere near that. So we need to be careful when we look at the situation in Benin this year. And one hopes that it's a really good crop, but if we listen to the trade, it's not. There's obviously vested interests in the trade, so we need to be careful, and that's why I recommend just taking a long look at the Benin situation if that's where your interest lies. Farm gate prices steady. International prices for Benin RCN have risen in the past week or so, a little, probably suggesting some interest from Indian buyers as the season opens up in Benin.
No, Jim.
If we look in Ghana, second crop underway, we're seeing material pouring in from the surrounding countries, as you'll be familiar with. it looks like a relatively normal situation for the time of year. Togo, very positive crop forecasts. Quality appears to be very good. And the estimates we've seen from our reporters, from the ACA reporters, is a crop of about 35,000 tons, which I hope they're right, but to me, it seems a little bit high on past history. Time will tell. The big question at the moment is Côte d'Ivoire. What is the likely outcome on the second crop in Côte d'Ivoire? So we've seen in the past 2 weeks that farm gate prices have remained relatively steady. There is a supporting mechanism in place, buying raw cashew nuts for delivery to domestically owned cashew factories that are in trouble. And that is supporting the market. The second crop has started. Those rains that we talked about 2 weeks ago were good news. And generally the crop still looks to be good, although there's no certainty on that just yet. There has been some farmers selling ahead of, to a certain extent, ahead of Easter holidays. We see some farmers selling, and that probably has kept prices fairly calm. I think farmers are probably happy enough with the prices that they're getting. Processors should be too. Efficient processors should be doing really well, but not all are efficient, of course. And they tell me there's about 400,000 tons harvested. But again, it's a huge country with a huge crop, and the figure may be higher than that by now. But generally speaking, a slightly more optimistic position than we talked about 2 weeks ago. If we look at Burkina, certainly reports are telling us that the problems mentioned a couple of weeks ago are confirmed, that the forecasts for the crop have been reduced. This is again down to the problems of the weather. There are also, sadly, some security concerns in Burkina which may interfere with the collection and assembly of the crop. The farm gate prices have been trading slightly lower. That's as farmers are releasing product for sale. Processors have been active in Burkina. It continues, but there is a question mark over the crop. If we look in Mali, rather similar situation, I think. Farmers did have a little bit of a sell-off as Ramadan arrived, and we probably see some impact of trade embargoes there. We see some impact of a lower crop, again, due to the weather. Elsewhere in Guinea, a good crop coming in, farmers are selling. International price is around 1150, 1200 asking price for 46 pounds, which looks relatively right compared to other origins. And Guinea-Bissau, it's interesting to note now that the government has increased the duties, or at least the method of calculation tends to increase the duties and the taxes. Minimum farm price is around 375 CFA. So it looks as if, generally speaking, the season will be higher cost in Guinea-Bissau. You're going to have higher export costs. You certainly have higher freight. You have reduced access to freight and to sailings. This will all have an impact on costs over the season. In terms of the crop, I'm still told that there is a good deal of optimism, and people are mentioning a crop up as high as 230,000 tons, which we've no way to verify, and neither have they, but that's the locals' best guess on it right now. And I think that'll be needed as well. But the question will be, to what extent the freight situation and the difficulties in export act as a barrier to trade when buyers want to be active and get their shipments out. So generally speaking, not a great deal of change in West Africa. The situation, we'll talk more about Senegal and the Gambia in the coming weeks. Generally, the picture from those two at the moment is relatively positive. So this information is gathered by the African Cashew Alliance, by our contacts and reporters around West Africa. And I would just like to extend my thanks and the thanks of the ACA and its members to those reporters for collecting that information, and ask them to keep up the good work. So let's try and bring that together a little bit. We'll have a look at some market indicators. So I've taken 4 market indicators and just tried to create a picture of how things look at the moment. So the first one is the crops, and If it's a red line going down, it means the news is not good. Orange is no change, and green is it's getting better. So traffic lights. So generally speaking, if we look in Southeast Asia, we see that the crop situation has worsened in the past 2 weeks. In India, it's actually not changed, but there's no more question mark over it right now than there was 2 weeks ago. And the situation in West Africa has improved, mostly because Cote d'Ivoire got those rains and the second flush is coming along quite nicely. If we look at farm gates as an indicator, farm gate prices pretty much unchanged in Southeast Asia and in West Africa. In India, slightly higher, probably reflecting better demand and probably reflecting a little bit more concern on the crop. Third indicator, the international RCN trade. So what we're seeing at the moment on prices is that over the past 2 weeks, and I think it probably started before that, from West Africa, prices have steadied up a little, maybe by as much as $50, maybe even a little bit more than that. We've certainly seen that costs have risen. That's going to be a feature of 2022. Fuel prices reflect onto freight prices. Markets move up. Also in some countries, higher taxes and export duties will also impact costs. And the trade volume has improved a little. We're seeing more trade, but we're not seeing the level of trade that we would have seen at this time last year. If we look at 320 prices, here there's been very little change. West Africa is still trading somewhere between 310 and 325 for 320s FOB. The last price I heard traded was $3.20. The range covers a processor who's got all the food safety in place, who knows how to market, down to a processor who would be less well qualified in both of those respects. And one of the interesting things is that there is a resale market developing where processors who essentially know what they're doing are buying from those who are less expert in marketing and reselling. In Vietnam, the market has steadied up a little bit, still remarkably low prices. And in Brazil, not much change, 320, still around $3.25. So in general, if we try and balance the factors that might force prices up and those that might force prices down, we see on balance over the last 2 weeks some upward pressure. Upward pressure coming from concerns on crops in Asia, the price of raw cashew nuts, a little bit more kernels buying, and overall costs, particularly freight, trucking. But they won't be the only costs that will rise in 2022. Putting more pressure on prices, although I have to say it's very moderate, is the West African crops and the improved situation on West African crops. So all in all, we're not seeing a great deal of change. There is probably, I would say, slightly more bullish feel to the market today than we would have seen 2 weeks ago. So if we look at the situation, we look again, I've picked 4 indicators. So crops, crop forecast remains good. I still think that the world crop will be as good as last year with balancing factors in different countries. But if India is lower, or if that second crop in West Africa doesn't come in as expected, that will change and it could easily hit the lower estimate, maybe even below that if things don't go right. If we look at the processing, we see, and this was something we looked at in detail, I'll just highlight a little last week. So we see that origin pricing, farm gate pricing, in other words, for raw cashew nuts tends to work for processors, either in West Africa or in India, or even in Vietnam, where kernels prices are so low, but that the international RCN prices do not work for processors at the moment. That effectively puts the efficient West African processors at a price advantage over their competitors in Vietnam. And the operative word there is efficient. If you're an efficient West African processor, your cost of processing, yes, it's probably higher than in Vietnam, but the difference between those two costs of processing and the cost of moving the raw material all the way around the world more than balances. So West African processors today, if they're efficient, are cost competitive and are achieving higher prices than their competitors in Vietnam. And this does bring big question marks. I mean, it asks whether or not it's the right thing to do to foster and support inefficient processors without actually addressing the reasons for the inefficiency. And I think that we need to look at this from the point of view that the long-term damage to the sector done by supporting an inefficient processor with a subsidy or a reduced price doesn't actually address the problem as to why they're inefficient in the first place. And that would be a cause for concern for the new and up-and-coming processors, particularly in Côte d'Ivoire. If we look at prices and demand, well, we still see 320s, Vietnamese prices very low, West African prices a little higher, Brazilian prices a little higher again, very attractive prices supporting demand. But so far, the lower kernels prices are not impacting the custom freight price. They are impacting the amount of trade, they're impacting the interest of processors, but the prices at this moment seem to be holding quite steady. Indeed, as I was mentioning, they've been rising. Buyers of kernels seem to be waiting the next opportunity. They don't want to, they're in a really good position at the moment in terms of the cost of product. They don't want to lose out on these low cost product, but they don't see any reason at the moment. Processors in Asia, meantime, or when they sell forward at least, let's say if they make a forward sale based on imported raw cashew nuts, they're selling below cost. And that must give rise to concerns amongst buyers in terms of contract fidelity. Will low price contracts be shipped in the event that the market goes up? And perhaps what we're seeing here is an indicator of a much more fundamental issue with processors, particularly in Vietnam. Overreaction to short-term factors, maybe that actually is an indicator of a much more fundamental issue in those businesses than simply a reaction to the market. It can't be a misunderstanding of the market. They've been around too long for that. And finally, we look at demand, and we're seeing pretty good demand trends as we've reviewed. I think it was 4 weeks ago, we had a look at 2021 demand, and we're going to have a look at it now this morning as well. So demand has been strong, but there is a lot of chat around about the Chinese demand, about the Russian war and the impact of that. And those are some of the things I wanted to have a look at today, which is why we decided to have a look at demand for cashew kernels. So let's start by just reminding ourselves of the overall situation on demand. Which countries, which consumers buy and consume cashew kernels. And when we look at it, we really need to focus on these three large markets. North America, with about 200,000 tons of kernels, about 22% of world consumption. Western Europe, essentially the European Union plus the UK and Switzerland, about 173,000 tons, a little more than that perhaps now, about 19% of world demand, and the largest market in the world, India, with about 33% of world demand. So when we look at those three markets, we see quite centralized demand for cashew nuts. Between the three of them, you're looking at about 74% of world demand. And when we talk about markets like China or like Russia, we need to always think in the context of the size of those markets compared to the general situation. So let's have a look at demand. And what I wanted to do was take the four major regions: India, the US, the European Union, and China, and just have a look at how the demand trends have worked out in recent years. So we took three different measures. We took the trend in demand up to 2019, so the 10 years pre-pandemic up to 2019. Then we looked at the 10 years up to last year, the latest figures that we have, for a long-term trend, including the pandemic, and then the 5 years, which is much more heavily influenced by the impact of the pandemic. So what we see is that India up to 2019 growing very strongly, 7.35%, fastest growing market at that time. That was dramatically slowed by the pandemic. And then if you look much more closely in the last 5 years, you see that the growth came to almost nothing. We saw a contraction in demand in India in 2020, to a lesser extent in 2021. In contrast, we look at the US market, where we had a relatively mature market, but still reasonable growth, 2.65%. That accelerated during the pandemic to over 5%. Average for the last 5 years, 3.58%. And the US market's interesting because within that 5-year window, you see a couple of major events. First of all, you see very high prices at the beginning of that period. So go back to the price rallies of 2017 and 2018. And don't forget, in terms of consumption, high prices in 2017 influences consumption in the following year. So you see high prices, then you see the pandemic. And interestingly, 2021, you see the highest rate of growth in imports for more than 20 years, 9.58%. So what we've seen in the US is a market that was growing relatively modestly but steadily has turned into a market that's been growing very quickly. Now, where do we go from there is the next question. EU market's a little bit different. The European market had been growing very strongly and has been really since, I would say, 2013. And so over a 10-year period, we were looking at 6.5% per annum growth. That's accelerated in the early part of the pandemic and then slowed again in the later part. So in all markets, we're seeing a balance between restrictions, which in some markets like India reduced consumption, but in other markets, increased consumption, particularly the US and Western Europe. And we're beginning to see return now toward what might be the pattern that we will see in the coming 5 to 10 years. And a lot of analysts who looked at the food business, it's not many look specifically at cashews, but when they look at the food business and the nut business, that's exactly what they're saying is happening. And the final market, China, appears to be very strong growth throughout, except in the last 3 months. But don't forget that strong growth in China, put it in context. The Chinese market is less than 1/3 the size of the Indian market. It's less than half the size of the US market. It's around about 55% of the European market. So fast growth is interesting, but it's not definitive in terms of the direction of demand. So what can we expect next in these markets? Well, I think what we're going to see in India is a return to growth. I think there is a kind of a pent-up demand in India. People are predicting there will be more marriages this year because those were restricted in the past 2 years, and more general ceremonies and family events. Cashews are consumed at those. We're seeing high almond prices, and in India, particularly North India, cashews compete with almonds. Almond prices are high now. That may offer some support for cashew nuts. And in general, we're seeing predictions over the last week or so of continued good economic growth in India. India's on the wrong side of oil prices, of course, but generally predictions seem to be good for the Indian economy over the coming years. So we think that demand in India will return to growth, and possibly to the level of growth that we saw before the pandemic, up around 7%. Now, if you think about it, 7% growth on 300,000 tons, this is serious. You really are looking at adding some quite significant demand into the market every year. In the US market, I think that lower prices over the past year, really certainly since October into this year, will continue to stimulate demand growth. We are seeing, I think, a slightly different dynamic in the US market. Over the past maybe 5 to 10 years, what's happened is that nuts have moved, they've shifted in the generations, and it's become a food that is much more popular with younger people. At one time, cashew nuts were regarded as a snack for the more affluent, older people. That's completely changed. And you can see that in the variety of products offered now. And I think that these low prices will continue to stimulate, at least for the next 12 months, faster growth. And I wouldn't be surprised if the US market were to grow by 5-6% this year in terms of imports. European Union, definitely a similar situation. There's no reason to think that this growth trend will be interrupted, but we do need to closely watch the needs of European consumers and the consciousness of European consumers toward issues like the environment and towards social sustainability. If those needs are not met, or if consumers believe those needs are not being met, then it could dent the growth in the consumption of cashew nuts. I think that from a West African processor's point of view, you're in an ideal position to meet those needs, closer to market, local processing, higher quality, traceability. These are all factors which meet consumer needs. There is a risk that moving 2.5 million tons of cashews halfway around the world for processing becomes an issue for consumers, particularly in Europe. Much more likely to happen in Europe than anywhere else, I think. If we look in China, for now, it looks on the trends as if the only way is up, but as we'll see in a moment, Chinese imports of cashews have collapsed in the early part of 2022. So generally on demand, the long-term picture quite positive. Question marks over sustainability, social sustainability, question marks over why the Chinese market has run into problems. Is it a long-term or a short-term issue? Let's have a look at some of the import statistics. So how has 2022 started? Well, US imports for the first quarter have reached a new record. I've analyzed it for December through to February because in the United States, the busy season extends into January. So we looked at December through to February, and we see that quite a healthy increase again. And if you consider that in 2019, the US imported just over 30,000 tons in those 3 months, December to February, and that's 40,000 tons in December 21 through to February 22. It's a really quite significant increase and quite encouraging. Look in Europe, and we see we've only got January figures so far for Europe, except for the UK. And so in Europe, we're seeing the Netherlands imports up. The Netherlands is the main point of import for redistribution. Germany, strong increase in imports. It may be that more product is being shipped directly to Germany. And then Italy, quite strong. France holding its own. And the UK, we have figures for January and February in the UK. They come out a little bit quicker in the UK, and it's about the same. And I wouldn't be surprised if by the time we get to the February and March figures that Germany and the Netherlands have lost a bit of this growth, and it's about the same as it was last year. But generally speaking, a strong start to the year in those two key markets. To get a little bit more current, we can look at the situation in Vietnam and ask how have shipments started there. So as you've probably heard, and there's much made of it, Vietnam's exports in the first quarter of 2022 are down by 5.6%. But we need to look behind those figures. And first thing I think we need to point out is that 2022 is still well ahead of 2020, and of course, miles ahead of 2019. So we're looking at more than 20% increase on 2019. but certainly down on 2021. If we look at markets excluding China, because China is the key market where we see a drop in imports in the first quarter of this year, it's actually down by 59%. But if we exclude all other markets, what we see is a picture that tends to reflect what we've seen in the European Union and the US imports, just under 3% increase in exports to other markets. What's going on in China is difficult to understand. We have, in the last few weeks, we have the restrictions due to the resurgence of COVID-19 and lockdowns there, and that certainly has an impact. And it looks a little bit like 2020. So this has happened before. We saw 2019 about 10,000 tons. Last year, a remarkably high figure, but in between 2020 and 2022, much reduced imports. So I don't think that we should make too many fundamental judgments as to a change in the trend of consumption in China. I think what we're seeing is a reaction to short-term factors. Now, this may be part of the reason for lower prices of kernels in Vietnam. China would be important for processors in Vietnam in terms of cash flow, fast payment. If you reduce exports from a figure of 15,000 tons recorded last year, which was a remarkable figure for that period, if you reduce that down to 6,000 tons in the first quarter of this year, that of course has a huge impact on the trade and on the processors and exports from Vietnam. So generally speaking, shipments from Vietnam look quite positive, just with that exception of what's happening in China. That would suggest that any issues related to that will work their way out of the system over the next 2 or 3 months. So generally speaking, pretty strong demand. Long-term factors, short-term factors give us the same indicators. The risk is always that we react to the short term thinking that it's showing a change in the overall trend. There's no reason to believe that. Demand for cashews is strong. What's driving it? Are these factors going to change? So we had a quick look at some of the factors. And again, so what I've done is I've looked at various pieces of research. We've looked at some of the statistics. We've talked to 1 or 2 people in the industry as to how they see what's driving demand. And there are some analysts, maybe not specific on cashews, but generally on the food business, that gave us some interesting clues. So what's really driving demand for cashew nuts in these 3 major markets, let's call them the 74% markets, India, the European Union, and North America, is consideration on health. The nuts were often regarded as healthy, but there was a fear or an association between nuts, particularly cashew nuts, and fat. So people were saying, yeah, nuts are good for you, but don't eat too many of them. But that's breaking. And it's because there's a better understanding of the constitution of cashew nuts. And there's been plenty of promotional work done on that. Not necessarily scientific research, although there is some, but a lot of promotion. And that is helping to promote nuts generally. And if nuts generally increase, cashews will increase too. Healthy snacking, less meat, which means more plant-based proteins. And that's particularly a factor in Europe, but also in the United States. And one of the interesting factors here is that when people eat less meat, they need to eat either alternative sources of protein, or they need to eat meat substitutes, which are becoming more popular. But something needs to give those flavor, and nuts, that's an opportunity for nuts. Other factors, convenience, taste, and these healthy choices. So people are looking for foods that have healthy associations. Products like ginger, turmeric, and nuts generally have now got this association as being a healthy choice. And that is definitely boosting consumption of these products. These are the big factor, what I call the big picture factors. And then we look at certain things that I think I'm going to call them boosters. They're opportunities. There are reasons why people might look at cashew nuts, and particularly why they might look at African cashew nut kernels. And these are, at the moment, what I call not the real drivers, but boosters, things that are accelerating growth or creating opportunity. Climate change, telling the story behind the product. The fact that now consumers are prepared to pay for sustainable products. The examples of organic or biofoods, where they pay premiums for products that they regard as sustainable, is a clear example, and it's growing really quickly. More and more important that workers and also growers are treated fairly. Supermarkets and their customers want to know about this. This idea of social sustainability. This is becoming more and more important. And you're going to see some products launched, cashew products launched in the coming weeks that will offer consumers choices in these areas. Assurance of correct treatment of workers. And this is becoming much more mainstream. That's been there in certifications like fair trade in the past, but it's now becoming much more mainstream and a much greater concern. And consumers, in some markets more than others, for sure, but consumers generally are becoming more accustomed to paying for those things. And you'll commonly hear people talk about the greatest challenge facing us all is climate change. So the situation for cashew nuts looks quite positive when you look at the factors that are driving demand. And if African cashew processors and growers and governments are prepared to look at these factors, you can see where to place your product in terms of playing into these factors, particularly these boosters, climate change, social sustainability. And there are lots of mechanisms now to formalize qualifications for businesses within those factors. But there are also some dark clouds on the horizon, and let's look at those. And these tend to be more short-term factors. So we see a lot of talk about inflation. We see talk about how a recession might impact the demand. And we even see on some of these chats, we see some talk about how the Russian invasion of Ukraine will impact cashew demand. These are relatively short-term factors. So we just did a quick look. We had a look at 3 recessions in Europe over the past 20 years or so. And we had the dot-com, a kind of a short-lived mini recession. We had the so-called Great Recession during the financial crisis, 2008, 9, and into 10. And the pandemic, of course. And generally speaking, when we look at these and you look at European Union imports over the period, it's been a pretty strong trend. During the Great Recession, there was a little downturn in 2010, but a relatively rapid recovery after that. So demand has proven resilient in past recessions. The demand has particularly proven resilient in periods of price stability. So you can see that from 2011, after the big price rise in 2011, prices then stabilized and we started to see really positive moves. So stability of prices is an important factor. In fact, the only other time we saw a downturn was during price instability in 2017, when prices, as you will recall, I'm sure, went sky high, 320s, headed up toward $5 at one stage. But in general, demand has proven resilient in past recessions. A similar analysis for the US market would show a similar result. Secondly, food price inflation has been around before the war. It's been impacting grains, and because grains are often feed, it's been impacting meat. It's been impacting fruit. Eastern Europe is a major source of fruit, particularly for Western Europe. Well, it hasn't impacted nuts so far. Nuts are still moving on the fundamentals. The third factor is that costs are rising. Can't get away from that. We've talked about that, oil prices and generally other costs too. So in fact, when we look at the situation and we look at how food price inflation is impacting a whole range of foods, it could actually mean that nuts generally might even look more attractive. So the food price inflation could in the end turn out to be something that nuts follow rather than something which negatively impacts on demand. I think also that we shouldn't get this picture, a very old-fashioned picture of the demand for nuts in general and cashew nuts in particular, is that it's something bought by rich people as a treat, that it's only bought with the extra money. That's really changed quite a lot. So that it's much more likely that people put nuts into their food basket, that they find them widely sold in discount supermarkets, widely sold at attractive prices, and that people understand that a lot better than they might have done in the past. So, but there still is a concern that the recession and the war, the combination of the two, could make damage to general demand of nuts. But I'd look at that a little bit differently. I actually think that this current situation, at a time when people are highly conscious of the impact of climate change and the impact of social sustainability, I think that it might even make consumers more health and more environmentally conscious. And if it does that, it will tend to accelerate the trends that we've talked about that are driving the demand for edible nuts. In cashews, we haven't as an industry been particularly good at taking advantage of those factors. The demand for cashews, particularly in the Western countries, has tended to be pulled along with the promotion of almonds and other nuts. If we start to promote cashew nuts, particularly African cashew nuts, as a sustainable, healthy, good tasting product, we could see remarkable results. So in summary, I don't think that the current situation, the war as it stands in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, a limited war, inflation as it stands, is likely to damage demand, and probably that the underlying trends in the demand for cashew nuts will lead to continued growth, particularly as prices currently are so low. So looking at the outlook, it may be that the buying opportunity for raw cashew nuts, the really good buying opportunity for raw cashew nuts and kernels, is beginning to close. We're beginning to see the end of the very cheap prices. We think that businesses will remain cautious in the circumstances, the political and economic circumstances, but that consumer trends, positive consumer trends towards nuts, may actually accelerate. Demand, as I think we've seen from the figures, is not the problem. So low cashew kernel prices in Vietnam are not due to demand. There is good demand out there. Shipments are evidence of that. Other factors, the second crop in Cote d'Ivoire is essential. It's essential for price stability, that's a good crop. Unfortunately, that's the way it looks right now. I think that low prices in Vietnam, they're not really an indicator of weak fundamentals in the cashew nut market. I think what they may be is much more an indicator of deep-seated problems in the structure and organization of processing in Vietnam, and particularly the dependence on imported raw cashew nuts. And finally, over the next 2 weeks, keep an eye on the Indian crop situation. It'll be updated in the ACA publications, the splits and the W450, but keep a good eye on that situation, because if there is a further bad news on the Indian crop, I think we would see a reaction in prices, and that will affect right back to the farm gate in West Africa. So that's the outlook as we see it for the moment. Thanks very much for listening. I'll pass you back to Ernest.
Thank you very much, Jim, for the excellent presentation on the crop and the markets outlook. Let me also say that if you have any questions, kindly drop them in the Q&A box, or also you can put them in the chat. There is one question in there by Jim. I think the last session this was addressed, and I will ask the questioner to rather contact the Nigerian Export Promotion Council. It address that issue for the last issue that we had. But Jim, you were talking about the fallacy of 1.1 million metric tons body, and then the reality probably lying around about 450,000 metric tons. I have a question here on the other platform that is saying that 2021 should be the test, whether indeed this 1.1 million is anything to continue talking about, or we should just discard it to where it belongs. What was the situation in the 2020? The test is 2021. What was the scenario as of 2021? So more or less, if you can paint the picture for the Asian production and inventory as of 2021, end of year, what did it, what kind of picture did we have? And then to be able to know where to place all the information that we are receiving, and then the kind of projection that we want to have or we want to see in 2022 for Asians.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, if you look back on our event, the first one of this season, going back to February, I think you will see that we did an analysis of the 2021 situation, Vietnam, Cambodia. And when we looked at that situation, you came down to pretty basic conclusion, which was either there's something like 800,000 tons somewhere in Vietnam, or it wasn't 1.1 million tons. And I think that's the 1.1 million tons is a factor that's already under discussion by Vinicas. People already have recognized that that figure was erroneous. I know for a fact in Cambodia, and in official circles in Cambodia, they also agree that that figure is not correct. So I don't think that we're testing this at all. I think it's already proven that the 1.1 million tons was an error. Simply take Vietnamese crop, imports, exports, consumption, and it shows it up. And you can do that calculation. If you want to look back at that video, I think they're on the ACA Facebook page and they're on YouTube. You can get a look and you can see the parameters that would suggest that that figure was not true. There's plenty of other evidence, by the way, too, but it's for example, if we go back to 2018, a crop survey showed 244,000 hectares planted in Cambodia, with addition of 50,000 hectares per annum. There's no yield factor anywhere in the world in cashews that suggests that the production from that could be 1 million tons a few years later. It's just not possible. So there's an error there, and I think it's proven. And again, as the season goes on, perhaps we'll have another look at that. I don't want to keep getting into it. The reason I brought it up this week was because it was again mentioned on a webinar, and it's just an error. And I know that will be corrected. When the final figures come out for Vietnamese imports for last year, I'm sure those figures will be corrected and they'll look more realistic. That'll probably be sometime at the end of this month. It's normally about it's only about a year later when the final figures come out. I mean, gathering these statistics is obviously a huge job, and then correcting them even bigger. Ernest.
All right, thank you very much, Jim. I think this question relates to the market indicators. where you had summed up the picture very nicely. I think it's also showing now. And you had talked about some kind of an imbalance in there. And the question is, what should amount to a balance? And is a balance really needed in the market? And really, in terms of the past, whenever there has been a balance, what has the situation been like? The question more or less is, do we really need a balance if you look at the way the industry is operating?
Okay, well, do we need a balance? No, it's a market. So we don't need a balance. Would we like a balance? In a way we would, because price stability is very good for business, for everyone's business. Volatility is just simply not something that's healthy. When I'm talking about a balance here, what I'm talking about is the balance between factors that forcing prices up and factors which might force prices down. That's the balance I'm talking about. If we talk about the balance between supply and demand, well, what we have seen in the past is that when supply and demand are closely balanced, and it doesn't take much to tilt pricing one way or the other. For example, in 2017, if you look back and look at the balance between supply and demand, you don't find that there is a huge shortage of cashew nuts in that year. No one ran out of cashew nuts that year, but prices moved up by more than 35%. So balance is one thing, fundamentals is one thing, but on the other side of that, you have market sentiment, high levels of speculation, lack of good market information, which causes people in the market to do things that maybe they otherwise wouldn't do. Some people get a chance to take advantage of that, to make some money out of it. So a balance is about, it's two aspects. So one side I'm talking about, let's look at these different factors that can impact the market at the moment. And then the second balance is the balance between supply and demand. The balance between supply and demand, a balanced supply and demand situation in cashews, because we really only know that maybe 6 or 8 months after the event, has very little impact. Much more impact is the sentiment in the market. So that's why I was saying earlier, if you go back to 2017, small crop in Cambodia at that time, they were harvesting about 220,000 tons a year at that moment. Vietnamese processors looked at it and thought, we don't have a great crop. We're going to get the Cambodian material, but we better get going in West Africa. And they did. Market went up. The rest is history. This year, they have, again, a small crop in Vietnam, but they have Cambodia beside them, possibly 450, 500,000 tons. Now that could add 2.5 months of processing over the period. And that's a big difference. It gives time. And this is one issue that probably needs to be thought about. If we think about Vietnamese buyers being so important for raw cashew nuts in West Africa, particularly in Côte d'Ivoire, in Nigeria. Vietnamese buyers being so important, they still need the raw material, there's no doubt about that, but they don't need it in as big a hurry as they might have once done. Combine that with an infrastructure which is struggling to manage the RCN, preserve the quality, offer finance into the market. And you see a situation where you could get a decline in quality. And of course, if you get a decline in quality, you get a decline in value. And this increases the challenge of managing the crop in West African countries. On the other hand, it also increases the opportunity for processors. So when the international buyers are quiet, local processors have an opportunity. And this current situation is, again, to me, an increasing argument to, one, improve the infrastructure for the handling of the crop as it comes in, and secondly, to build the processing infrastructure and to encourage the development of that, because that is the best way to manage a crop which needs to be handled very quickly after harvest, and in which post-harvest handling is essential to maintaining quality. You can't leave cashews lying on the ground for 10 days. They need to be moved, they need to be dried, and they need to be processed. So it's a really interesting question, and there's so many different answers to it. I hope I've given you some thoughts on it there. Ernest.
Thank you very much, Jim. Let me pick from Zoom. There is also a question here about, I think when you started, you rightly mentioned that we don't have information from Senegal and Gambia yet, and that in the next session, the next division, we will be providing that information. So I will skip that and then talk more about the same question from probably the same person. We would like to have information on export kennels from Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, and Gambia towards you and the US. Whether you have any rough idea.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, the exports of kernels from those three countries are pretty small. Processing is relatively light. We're looking at, I'm sure I have the exact figures, but I think we're looking at figures in the hundreds of tons, if that. I'll see if I can look it up quickly while I'm talking to you. But I mean, you know the exports because you know the processing, and so it's not to say that there isn't an opportunity for processing in those countries. It's just to say that it hasn't happened yet. I think it's important in those countries to have a particular consideration of the scale of processing. So even the existing processors in those countries are quite small, and that makes them less attractive to buyers. It makes them less attractive to generally to develop a relationship. So Guinea-Bissau, exports of kernels from Guinea-Bissau peaked at 770 tons. They collapsed during the pandemic, having risen quite quickly. Do I have figures for Senegal? Senegal, I know, has been a very low figure. I don't have the figure to hand. And the Gambia, I think we're talking in literally a handful of containers in any given year. But I do know there are businesses there that may be capable. And perhaps those smaller businesses might consider looking at adding higher levels of value rather than trying to compete on bulk container loads of cashew kernels. We will have a look at that region in detail in a couple of weeks as the harvest there starts to come on.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Jim. Now let us move into the cashew kernel demand growth in major markets. And then you had made a statement about China, saying that the reactions, whatever is happening with China is more reactions to short-term factors. So I have a question here. Can we know what these short-term factors are and track them over the next editions of the, I'm sure, the global market encounter? Whether we can begin to, because it looks more like, if you look at the 5-year average, it is showing that in China, compared to the 10-year average, the growth in China has not been as the process is happening in the other regions. So more or less, it's more an issue which is of importance to our listeners, and we want to know what these short-term factors are and whether we can track them over the next few.
So there's the growth chart on the screen, and you can see in the 10 years up to 2019, you're looking at just over 7% growth in the Chinese market. Most of that quite recent, actually. You're looking at the 10 years to 2021, almost 9% growth. So we have seen very fast growth. Now, there's a couple of factors that need to be mentioned in here. First of all, the recording of trade on the Vietnam-China border in the past 10 years has not always been accurate. There's been a certain amount of informal trade in the past that has been changed, so that the level of growth might be slightly exaggerated over that period. There's no way to track informal trade, and China was never a big enough market that we could extrapolate that calculation. That's one factor. The second factor is the immediate short-term impact of COVID-19, lockdowns, as they're called, unfortunately, in some Chinese cities. That's bound to have an impact on distribution, and also some difficulties in cross-border trade between Vietnam and China, with situations where vehicles, containers, and so on are waiting. So these are the short-term factors that impact demand. But I think also we had a look at the volatility. Let's have a look at that. We had a look at the volatility of trade between China and Vietnam. So going back to the first quarter of 2019, 10,000 tons, and that collapsed during the initial stages of the pandemic in China during the first quarter of 2020. After that, interestingly, in 2020, demand did recover, and the monthly imports went back to something that was relatively normal in 2020. That could also happen in 2022. So short-term factors, difficulties in cross-border trade, difficulties with lockdowns and COVID-19 undermining buyer confidence and buyer activity in the market. And when that happens at a crucial period in the run-up to the Chinese New Year, naturally, you're going to get an impact. Ernest.
I have another question here. It looks like we have currently for the 320, the price differential is about $30, and you are indicating that that could be still something in terms of transportation costs, or something that transportation costs would account for. Have you looked at the transport cost over maybe the last 3, 4, 5 years to see whether the price, according to the kernel prices for IVC compared to Vietnam, whether that kind of transport cost is really within the range of the $30? And again, whether there is some kind of an advantage there for IVC in terms of the rising transport costs, or the transport costs are really in the minimum.
So if we look at transport costs on cashews, up to 2020, the overall level of cost of transportation of a 20-foot container was so low that it was hardly a factor in the discussion. You know, we're looking at prices as low as $600-700 a ton to move a container from Asia to Western Europe. Obviously, that's changed dramatically. So at the moment, an element of the price premium being paid in West Africa is definitely freight. Now, that has narrowed somewhat in the last couple of months because freight rates have moderated a little bit in Asia, or from Asia, and freight rates in West Africa have gone up. So I think we're going to see increases in freight rates from West Africa, but still, there is a freight advantage in buying in West Africa, also in East Africa, for shipment if you're going west, particularly if you're going to North America or if you're going to Europe. But this is not the only factor. It would be a mistake to think that the premium price being paid either in Brazil or in West Africa for cashew kernels at the moment is just about freight. It's not. Freight's an element, but also factors like voyage time, reliability, quality of the product. These are basics, but we also have to consider local processing is a factor. The interest of buyers to diversify their sources of supply with their high dependence on Vietnam. I mean, due to a superb job done in Vietnam on processing development, but that high dependence at some point is going to become alarming for buyers, and they want to reduce their dependence on a single supplier. The interest of buyers in a sustainable product. So clearly, whereas cashews are, as I think I said recently in one of our chats, we talked about cashews being the most sustainable of all the tree nuts, but with one glaring exception, and that is the international trade in raw cashew nuts, which is from an environmental point of view, not at all sustainable. That's a factor for buyers. So when we look at this premium, it's not just about freight. Freight is one element. It's also about all of those other factors. And those factors are important because those are the factors that are driving demand. And this is why we're seeing buyers engaging or re-engaging in West Africa now that we see more processors coming to market. And as we see more processing and we can see factories coming up now, or projects at least coming up in Nigeria, in Cote d'Ivoire, we've seen it already a little to a certain extent in Ghana and other countries, we will see more buyers engaging. And I know that the buyers who've visited in recent months have been impressed with the developments, and this will encourage them to come back for more product. So it is not correct to think, and it's important that we stress this, if freight rates were to equalize between West Africa and Vietnam or India, that would not change buyers' outlook. More important factors such as 20-day voyage times, reliability, origin processing, sustainability in all its guises would be important factors too. And to me, it seems that probably that premium is justified and will remain in place for the foreseeable future. Ernest.
Thank you very much, Jim. Now we move to the production in West Africa. From the market indicator overview you gave, it looks like production is going to be very stable, especially in the West Africa, rising from the issue pointing upwards. And the issue is that Burkina Faso, we have some problems mentioned there, Mali, Guinea-Bissau, and then the next question then is more on Cote d'Ivoire. You are recording about 400,000 metric tons at this stage. So looking at the entire picture of West Africa and also the production from, or whatever has been achieved so far, 400,000 metric tons for Cote d'Ivoire, does it look positive that we reached levels of 2021 in terms of
Ernest, I lost the very end of your question there.
So looking at the issues where we are not even sure of the crop in Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Mali, and then also a bit of issues with some of the other countries. The questioner wants to know if you have the level of production or whatever has been purchased so far, 400,000 metric tons, Cote d'Ivoire. Compared to the situation last year, are we on course to sustain the level of raw cashew nut production in West Africa this year? Would it go up? Would it come down? Looking at what is playing out in the other countries and looking at the fact that we have about 400,000 metric tons this time of the year.
I would say that we're probably a little bit behind last year, generally speaking, in terms of where we are by the middle of April. I think that I'm hopeful and I expect the Cote d'Ivoire crop will meet the forecast, but certainly Nigeria will be reduced. The Nigerian crop had a slow start, but it seems to be getting going now, and buying is going quite well. Local processors more active this year. What is coming to the fore, and maybe this is something we need to bear in mind as Guinea-Bissau comes online, is that logistical problems in Nigeria have, again, and this is not the first time, they're there getting in the way of efficient export. The question marks, if we talk about question mark countries at the moment, the question marks would be over what the situation in Benin is. Question marks would be over how well will Guinea-Bissau cope with maybe a single line for export shipments and maybe a good crop, but a difficulty in the management of that crop. And questions as to the crop in Mali and Burkina Faso and the impact of the weather on those. So we're only going to know the answers to those questions over the coming weeks. But if we were to take it snapshot year for year, we're probably a little bit behind where we were this time last year.
So we have a question which takes us more into local consumption. It's referring to Ghana, but I believe it's also for the rest of Africa. How do we really promote local consumption in Africa? Any ideas you have for some of the other countries from Europe in terms of how to promote? We've talked about the health, promoting the health benefits, but then again, how do we here in West Africa generally promote local consumption?
I think that if we look at the competitive advantages of West African cashew nuts, and I mean, I think we could also say these things about cashew nuts from East African countries too. But if we look at the factors that make them competitive, they're directly in line with the major trends in the market, those things that I called the booster factors. So there's no doubt that processing close to where the product grows is more sustainable. There's no doubt that the growers of that product are more likely to be more fairly rewarded by a local processor than by a processor that's 15,000 kilometers away. There's a much greater chance that the product comes to market in a fresher, tastier condition as a single origin processed product than as a mix of all kinds of origins, which may or may not reach the market 6, 7, 8 months after it's been harvested. And if we look at the current situation, when we look at some of the roadblocks in the RCN trade, there are probably cashew nuts which are being shelled in these weeks that were harvested 18 months ago. They can still be harvested, but they're not the same product as a freshly processed product. So I think in terms of the arguments on sustainability, on the carbon footprint of the industry, these are very strong arguments in promoting West Africa. It can give a competitive advantage, but it doesn't mean that inefficient systems, inefficient processors will thrive. And I think we have to also consider that efficiency in the process, cost competitiveness particularly, but also efficiency in food safety are important factors. So many buyers may not know African cashew nuts. Many buyers who've been buying cashew nuts for a long time may not have even visited African producing countries, even though those countries are major producers of the product. And that awareness needs to be built. Organizations like the African Cashew Alliance has a key role to play in that. It seems to me that one of the other aspects that we need to look at is the consistency across the industry. Even today, we look at processors, new generation processors, large processors. Standards across the board are very different. And whether or not you think African cashews are really good depends on your supplier. And if there's a wide variation between suppliers, that's going to be a very confusing message. So I think it's important that we promote an industry that is efficient, an industry that is sustainable, and play to its strengths. And the strengths of West African cashews, for example, are, look at the map. It's the location, it's the journey time, it's the proximity to those two huge markets, North America and Europe. And that is a key advantage. If the costs and the processing can be done efficiently, as is being done by many now, but not by all, then it becomes a very promotable product.
So the last question is talking about what is the volume of the crop. Cambodia, I think we've answered that already, around about 450,000 metric tons. But then the issue of quality from Cambodia compared to last year. I think we haven't touched on quality even in most of the other producing areas, but can you address what are we thinking in terms of quality of raw cashew nuts this year around?
I am told by friends in Cambodia that they're experiencing slightly lower quality this year, which explains slightly lower prices for the raw cashew nuts. I would say in general terms, the quality of cashews from Cambodia has been very good. When you see Cambodian kernels, there's not an awful lot of processing in Cambodia, but the kernels are large. They are lovely taste. We have some really good samples here of flavored cashews from Cambodia, and I'd be very, very encouraged over the long term. But this year, definitely due to the weather, not only is the volume lower than expected, but the quality is probably a little bit lower than expected, and that is reflected in the price of the raw cashew nuts in Cambodia. So you might be looking at, you know, £48 instead of 50. You might be looking in some cases at lower than that.
Thank you very much, Jim. I think at this point, we don't have any further questions, and I would like for you to take us through what to expect after the Easter breaks. I know we will skip one edition and then come back after the Easter break. So what should we expect?
Yeah, I think we can probably expect from markets in Europe and North America relatively quiet period over the next 2 weeks. A lot of people take some extra days off during this period. I think at the same time that there will be continued interest in buying kernels. I don't expect any major changes in the pattern of buying of kernels. It probably would be a good time if someone wanted to make a move. It'd be quite a good time to do so, but I don't expect that will happen. I'll be watching the development of the crop in Côte d'Ivoire. I'll be watching the crops, particularly as they start to come online in Guinea-Bissau. I'll be watching the news from Burkina and Mali in terms of those crops. I'll be watching kernels buyers as always, and it'll be very interesting to see by the end of April what the tonnage from Cambodia exported into Vietnam will be, and we'll then start to get a real idea of what's needed. What is happening, of course, is that the calendar doesn't stop, the clock doesn't stop, and the window for buying and getting shipments to Asia for processing is becoming narrower. And with that in mind, we should also be watching the demand in India, the biggest market in the world, and we probably don't talk about it as much as we should. But if demand in India starts to rack up the way it's expected to, then we're going to see some further interest in buying raw cashew nuts. That's what I'll be looking at over the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jim Fitzpatrick. It's been a pleasure having you. And so we come your way again on the 4th of May with the next edition of the Global Markets Encounter. It's many thanks to you and many thanks to the participants also. And to mention that the registration for the ACA conference, which is being held this year in September in Abuja, has started, and please come onto our website and start your registration process. So Jim, we'll meet again on the 4th of May, and please stay safe and get well soon. And be stronger there. Yeah, so bye-bye for now, and talk to you again. Bye.
Thanks, Ernest. Thanks, everyone. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.
What do you care most when buying color sorters? What makes better sorting performance? What ensures high stability and reliability regardless of 1 unit or 10,000 units? Quality is all. Mayer's Smart Factory is built for production of color sorters and dental CBCT. The factory has completed its first phase construction